The silence of Ethelgard did not exist in the way humans understood it. It was not the absence of noise, but a suffocating pressure of unuttered light. Above me, the sky of the capital city, Orizon, swirled with violet and emerald auroras, the constant, shimmering chatter of a race that spoke in spectra. To them, I was a biological anomaly, a dull, lightless creature of meat and bone. To my own kind, I was worse. I was the man who had sold the encryption keys to the K9 asteroid station, resulting in the vaporization of 1,200 souls. "Stand straight, Vance," High Commissioner Valerius hissed, his breath smelling of stale synthetic caffeine and fear. "You are a shadow, a piece of the background. If you so much as sneeze without a permit, I will personally see you ejected from the nearest airlock without a suit. Understood?" I adjusted the collar of my borrowed diplomatic robes. They were 3 sizes too large, an intentional insult to remind me of how much I had shrunk in status. I did not look at him. I looked at the marble floor, which pulsed with a soft, rhythmic amber glow. The palace security system checking our heartbeats. "Understood, sir," I replied. My voice sounded like gravel grinding in a lead pipe. I had not used it for anything other than basic requests for 6 months. "Good. Remember, the Ethel do not negotiate with grunts, especially disgraced ones. You are here to monitor their light frequency transmissions and provide the text-to-speech bridge. Keep your damn mouth shut and your eyes on the sensor slate. You're just a meat computer now." We marched through the grand arch of the prism. The architecture was an impossibility of translucent crystal and biopolymer, grown rather than built over 5 centuries. Every pillar hummed with the collective consciousness of the Ethelgard court. As the diplomatic procession moved forward, I felt the familiar itch behind my eyes, the remnant of the neural shrapnel I'd taken during the K9 explosion. It was a reminder of the truth I couldn't prove, that I hadn't sold the keys. I had been framed by someone who knew the Coalition's protocols better than I did. The throne room was a cathedral of blinding brilliance. At the far end, Empress Celia sat upon a pedestal of living quartz. Her skin was the color of a dying star, etched with intricate silver patterns that flared whenever she felt a flicker of emotion. Around her, the archconsuls stood like frozen statues of light, their frequencies synchronized in a low, humming gold. Valerius stepped forward, dropping into a deep, agonizingly long bow. "Your Radiance," he began, his voice amplified by the translation drones hovering nearby. "The Terrasol Coalition comes in the spirit of the Harmony Accord. We seek to renew the trade routes through the Nebular Gate." The Empress did not speak with her mouth. Instead, a wave of cerulean light washed over the room, and the translation slate in my hand scrolled with text. "Your words are a steady frequency, Commissioner, but your shadow carries a heavy dissonance." I felt Valerius stiffen beside me. He knew she was referring to me. I kept my head down, focusing on the data streams. But my peripheral vision caught a movement to the right of the throne. A young woman stood there, draped in silks that looked like woven starlight. She was the Princess Isora. I had read the classified dossiers. She was the heir to a throne she could never truly inherit. In a world where status was measured by the complexity of one's light song, she was a void, a dissonant. She was born without the ability to project or perceive the high-frequency light speech of her people. I watched her. While the Empress and Valerius engaged in the tedious dance of interstellar politics, Isora stood in total isolation. Her eyes, the color of molten silver, scanned the room with a desperate, frantic intelligence. She wasn't looking at the flashes of light. She was looking at hands. She was looking at the way people shifted their weight. She was looking at the vibrations of the crystal floor. She was drowning in a sea of information she couldn't decode. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that moment, I didn't see an alien princess. I saw myself at the K9 court-martial. I saw the look of someone who had been condemned to a life of silence while the world screamed its judgments all around them. The meeting dragged on. Valerius was sweating through his fine silks, struggling to keep up with the Empress's shifting moods, which manifested as rapid-fire bursts of crimson and orange light. The drones were struggling to translate the nuance. Archconsul Varric, a towering figure with skin like hammered obsidian, stepped forward. His light pattern was a jagged, aggressive yellow. "The human presence is a stain on this sanctum," the slate read. Why do you bring a traitor into the prism? Valerius stammered. He is a necessary tool, Your Excellency, a specialist in archaic ciphers. He is under total restraint. I felt the arch-consul's gaze burn into me. I felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. To them, I was a broken tool. To my own people, I was a walking corpse. I looked back at Isora. She was leaning against a crystalline pillar, her fingers tracing the jagged edges of the quartz. She looked so profoundly alone that it cracked the armor I'd built around my heart. Without thinking, my fingers twitched. It was a muscle memory from the deep space scouting days, where radio silence was the law, and we spoke with our hands using the reflex sign protocol. It was a language designed for the dark, for the forgotten, for those who had to operate beneath the notice of the enemy. I kept my hands low, hidden by the folds of my oversized robes. I formed the signs for hello. I see you. The effect was a kinetic shock. Isora's head snapped toward me. Her eyes widened, the molten silver shimmering with a sudden, violent hope. Her breath hitched, a sound that ripped through the rhythmic humming of the throne room like a gunshot. Every light in the room turned a sharp, defensive white. The arch-consul's hand went to the hilt of his pulse blade. Valerius looked like he was about to have a heart attack. The Empress rose from her throne, her silver patterns glowing with the intensity of a supernova. Who spoke? The translation slate screamed in bold red letters. There was a sound that did not come from the light. I realized then that I had just committed a capital offense. I had broken the silence of the Ethelgard. I had acknowledged the invisible. The air in the throne room turned frigid. In Ethelgard, a physical sound made by a commoner was an act of desecration. A sound made by the royalty was a sign of impending madness. Isora stood frozen, her hand pressed against her mouth as if she could pull the gasp back into her lungs. Valerius turned to me, his face a mask of purple-veined fury. "Vance, you idiot! What did you do?" he hissed, his voice trembling so hard I thought his teeth might rattle out. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on Isora. She wasn't looking at the guards or her mother. She was staring at my hands, her fingers twitching in a subconscious attempt to mimic the gestures I just made. She hadn't understood the words, but she had understood the intent. For the first time in 21 years, someone had directed a targeted, meaningful signal specifically to her. "Step forward, human," the Empress commanded through the drones. Her light song was now a cold, crystalline blue, the color of an ice shelf about to break. I moved. My boots felt like they weighed 100 kilograms each. I stopped 3 meters from the base of the throne and dropped to one knee. I didn't do the diplomatic bow. I gave her the soldier's salute, fist over heart. "Your radiance," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline dumping into my system. "Explain the dissonance," the slate read. "You moved your hands." My daughter reacted. "What poison are you spreading in my court?" "It is not poison, Your Radiance," I replied, looking up. I met her eyes, a feat that made Valerius make a small, pathetic whimpering sound. "It is a language. From my world. We call it the reflex sign protocol. It is used when the voice is a liability and the ears are closed." "A language?" Arch-Consul Varric stepped down from the dais, his yellow light pulsing like a warning siren. A primitive clicking of joints and flapping of skin? "You dare suggest such a barbaric display as communication?" I turned to Varric. I had spent 15 years breaking the ciphers of the void sovereignty. I had looked into the eyes of war criminals who had burned entire moons. Varric was just another bully in a fancy suit. "With all due respect, Arch-Consul, I've watched your drones struggle to translate the nuance of the Empress's light for the last hour. My language doesn't require power cells or frequency relays. It requires a heart and a pair of eyes. I saw the princess. I saw that she was not part of your conversation, so I invited her into mine. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the heavy pressure of the ethel light. It was the genuine, stunned vacuum of a court that had forgotten how to be challenged. Isora suddenly moved. She bypassed the guards and the arch-consuls, her starlight silks hissing against the crystal floor. She stopped a foot away from me. This close, I could see the faint silver veins beneath her translucent skin. She smelled like ozone and cold rain. She reached out, her fingers hovering near my hands. She made a gesture, a clumsy, hesitant imitation of the hello I had shown her. She did it wrong, her thumb tucked too far in, but the question in her eyes was as clear as a distress flare. "Is this real?" she seemed to ask. "Am I really hearing you?" I raised my hand slowly, ensuring the guards saw every movement. I corrected her gesture, gently nudging her thumb into the right position. "Hello," I signed again, slower this time. Then I added, "Friend." Isora let out a jagged, sobbing laugh. It was a raw, human sound that seemed to shatter the very air of the prison. She grabbed my wrists, her grip surprisingly strong, and buried her face in my shoulder. The Empress descended the stairs. The blue light of her skin softened into a pale, shimmering lavender, the color of mourning and sudden realization. She stood over us, her presence like the warmth of a sun. For 20 years, she has been a ghost in my own house. The Empress's light speech translated with a heartbreaking softness. My scholars said her mind was as dark as her ears. They said she was a biological hollow. She looked at Varric, then back at me. And yet, in 10 seconds, a disgraced human with nothing but his hands has found the key to the door we've been hammering on for 2 decades. Valerius tried to interject, sensing a shift in the political wind. "Your Radiance, while this is heartwarming, we must discuss the trade agreements. This man is a criminal, a traitor to Terrasol. He is not fit to—" "Silence him," the Empress signaled. The palace guards moved with terrifying speed. 2 of them gripped Valerius by the arms and dragged him backward. He didn't scream. He knew better. He just looked at me with a hatred that promised a slow death if I ever stepped foot back on a coalition ship. Archconsul Varric's light was a low, simmering orange, the color of embers before a fire. "This is irregular, Your Radiance. We know nothing of this protocol. It could be a form of hypnotic conditioning. The human could be planting seeds of rebellion in the air." "He is already doing that, Varric," the Empress replied. "He is teaching her that she has a voice, and a voice is the greatest rebellion of all." She looked at me, her silver eyes searching mine. "You were a soldier, Callum Vance, a breaker of codes. I was, Your Radiance, and now you are a teacher. You will remain here, in the prism. You will be housed in the Tower of Echoes. You will teach my daughter every sign, every gesture, every silent word your people possess." I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. This wasn't a request. It was a gilded cage. But then I looked at Isora. She was still holding my wrists, her eyes fixed on me, with a devotion that felt like a heavy, beautiful weight. "Your Radiance, I am a prisoner of my own government," I said. "I have no standing." "You have my protection," the Empress signaled, her light flaring with a final, absolute authority. "And in Ethelgard, that is the only currency that matters. If you succeed, perhaps we will look into the records of this K9 station. I have found that those who speak the truth in silence are often the ones blamed for the lies told in the light." She turned to Varric. "Prepare the quarters. Ensure the human has everything he needs." "And Varric," the Archconsul bowed, his light flicking to a subservient green. "Yes, Your Radiance. If a single hair on this man's head is harmed, I will consider it an act of war against the crown. Is that clear?" "Crystal," the Archconsul signaled. But as he turned away, his light shifted for a split second to a deep, bruised purple, the color of a secret vendetta. Isora let go of my wrists and stepped back. She looked at me, her face glowing with a quiet intensity. She raised her hand, tentatively forming the sign for friend that I had just taught her. She got it right this time. I smiled, the first real smile I'd felt since the stars went out at K9. I signed back, always. As the guards led us toward the Tower of Echoes, I looked out at the sprawling crystal city of Orzen. I had come here to be a ghost, to fade into the background and wait for the end. Instead, I had become the bridge for a princess who had been silenced by her own blood. But as we walked through the shimmering corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling of Varric's purple light. I was an intelligence officer. I knew when a trap was being set. The Empress wanted a voice for her daughter, but there were those in this palace who preferred the silence. And they wouldn't just sit by while a meat puppet from Earth rewrote the rules of their world. The war for Ethelgard hadn't started with ships or cannons. It had started with a gesture, and I knew with the grim certainty of a man who had seen too much that the silence was about to get very, very loud. We reached the base of the tower. Isora stopped and pointed upward, then to herself, and then to me. It was a question. Together? I nodded and signed, together. I didn't tell her that in my experience, the people who build bridges are usually the first ones targeted by the people who want to burn them. I just followed her into the light, my hands ready to speak the truths that words could no longer carry. The first layer of the truth had been peeled back. I wasn't just a translator. I was a weapon in a war of frequencies I didn't yet understand. And for the first time in 6 months, I didn't want to die. I wanted to see what the princess would say when she finally had the words to say it. Is there a star you hold on to when the darkness feels overwhelming? I wondered, looking at the alien auroras above. Because I think I just found mine. The Tower of Echoes was a monument to a past the Ethel were trying to forget. It sat on the far eastern edge of the palace complex, a jagged needle of obsidian and silver that refused to harmonize with the rest of the crystalline architecture. While the rest of Orozen hummed with the soft, melodic frequencies of the light song, the tower was dead air. It was a place for the forgotten, for the dampeners, and now for a disgraced cryptographer and a princess who lived in a soundless world. The interior was cold. The walls didn't glow here. They absorbed light like hungry shadows. I walked through the main atrium, my boots clicking against stone that hadn't felt a warm vibration in 40 years. Beside me, Isora moved with a strange, fluid grace. She didn't look at the shadows. She looked at me, her eyes tracking the slight tension in my jaw, the way my hand hovered near the phantom weight of a sidearm I hadn't been allowed to carry for 6 months. Your quarters are on the 72nd floor, a guard signaled. He was a tall, lean Ethel named Kalis, his skin a permanent, distrustful shade of jagged slate gray. The Arch-Consul expects a progress report by 0600 hours every morning. I looked at the guard. His light was flickering with a rhythmic pulse that felt like a headache. Tell the Arch-Consul to take a hike, I said, my voice echoing in the hollow space. I need 3 days to establish a baseline before I write a damn thing. If he wants results, he needs to let me do my job without breathing down my neck. Kalis's skin flared a sharp, defensive orange. You forget your place, human. You are a ghost, a piece of surplus hardware we haven't scrapped yet. I stepped into his personal space. I was shorter than him, but I'd spent my life staring down coalition generals and hegemony interrogators. I leaned in close, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rasp. Listen to me, you glorified glow stick. I've broken ciphers that would make your little light show short-circuit. I took a hit meant for your empress while you were standing around looking pretty. So unless you want to explain to Isora why her only bridge to the world just walked out a window, you'll give me my space. Check your 6, soldier. You aren't the only one watching. The guard's light dimmed to a sullen, muddy brown. He didn't speak again, but the way he gestured toward the grav lift was anything but friendly. Isora touched my arm. She didn't need to hear the words to understand the vibration of my anger. She raised her hand and signed a question she'd practiced in the hallway. Danger? I looked at her, the anger draining out of me like water through a sieve. I forced my features to soften, a skill I'd nearly lost in the trenches of the K9 fallout. I raised my hands, making sure they were within her field of vision. No danger, just a noisy guard. He thinks he's high brass, but he's just a grunt. She tilted her head, her silver eyes reflecting the dim light of the tower. She signed back. Grunt? I laughed, a short, dry sound. Military slang. It means someone who does the heavy lifting, but doesn't get the credit. Like a gear in a machine. She processed this, her fingers tracing the air. I am a grunt? I shook my head firmly. No. You are the pilot. I'm just the navigator. We reached the 72nd floor. The suite was massive, a circular room with floor-to-ceiling windows of polarized quartz that showed the triple sunset of Ethelgard. The sky was a bruised palette of violet, gold, and deep indigo. Below us, the city was beginning its nocturnal dance, the lights of the commoners flickering like a sea of bioluminescent plankton. Isora walked to the window. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, Her shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of 1,000 years of exhaustion. She was 21 years old, but in this light, she looked like an ancient soul trapped in a beautiful, silent prison. I stood back, giving her space. My tactical training told me to secure the perimeter, to check for listening devices and hidden sensors. But my intuition, the part of me that had survived by reading the spaces between the lines, told me that the most important thing in this room wasn't the security, it was the girl. I walked to a side table where a carafe of blue shimmering liquid sat. I poured a glass and sat on a low stone bench. I didn't push. I didn't sign. I just sat there breathing, letting her realize that for the first time in her life, she wasn't being watched as a problem to be solved or a defect to be hidden. She was just being seen. 10 minutes passed. The first moon, a pale, jagged crescent, rose over the horizon. Isora turned away from the window and sat on the floor across from me. She didn't use the ornate chairs or the silk cushions. She sat on the hard stone, mirroring my posture. She began to sign, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were afraid I wouldn't understand. "Why you stay?" I paused, the blue liquid cool against my throat. The Empress commanded it, I signed back. She shook her head, a sharp, dismissive motion. "No. Why you stay? You are sad. You have the ghost look. My mother says you are a traitor. Why help a dissonant?" I set the glass down. The truth was a heavy thing, but I realized I couldn't lie to her. Not here, in the shadows where the light speech couldn't reach us. "I stay because I am also a dissonant," I signed. "On my world, they told me I was broken. They said I was a monster because I couldn't prove the truth. Being here, with you, it's the only time I don't feel like a ghost." Isora's expression shifted. It wasn't pity, it was a profound, agonizing empathy. She reached out and touched my hand, her fingers cold as ice. "We are two ghosts in one tower," she signed. I looked at her, and for a moment, the weight of the K9 massacre, the faces of the 1,200 people I couldn't save, the shame of the court-martial, it all felt a little lighter. I wasn't just a meat computer. I wasn't just furniture. "Tomorrow," I signed, "the real work begins. I won't just teach you how to sign. I'll teach you how to see the patterns, how to read the room. If we're going to survive this court, you need to be more than a princess. You need to be an operative." She nodded, a fierce, determined light in her silver eyes. She stood up and walked toward her sleeping alcove, but stopped at the threshold. She turned back and signed one last word: "Teacher." I sat in the darkness long after she'd gone to sleep. I pulled out my old service slate, the one bit of human tech I'd managed to smuggle through the checkpoints. I opened a hidden file, an encrypted log of the K9 transmissions. I had looked at these thousands of times, searching for the ghost in the machine, the signature of the real traitor. I looked at the window, at the reflection of the obsidian walls. Something was bothering me. The Ethel were a race of light, but their history was full of shadows. And as I stared at the data, a thought occurred to me. If Isora was born deaf, why did she have the neural architecture for high-frequency reception? The dossiers said she was a biological hollow, but the way she'd reacted to my sign, the speed of her processing, it didn't fit. It wasn't a lack of hardware, it was a software override. I closed the slate. The first layer was beginning to peel back, and I had a feeling that what lay beneath wasn't just a political conspiracy, it was a crime against a daughter. I leaned back against the stone wall, the cold seeped into my bones. Sleep was a distant hope. I had a princess to train and a viper's nest to navigate. But as I closed my eyes, I didn't see the fire of K9. I saw the molten silver of Isora's eyes. The silence, I realized, was finally starting to make sense. By the third day of our isolation in the Tower of Echoes, the routine had settled into a rhythm that felt dangerously like peace. We spent 8 hours a day on the balcony, the light of the 3 suns warming the obsidian stone, as I put Isora through the most grueling linguistic training of her life. I didn't start with the alphabet. I started with concepts, power, betrayal, observation, survival. I taught her the reflex sign protocol not just as a way to say hello, but as a tactical tool. "Don't just look at the hand," I told her, my voice low even though no one was supposed to be listening. Watch the shoulder. If the shoulder tenses before the hand moves, they're lying. If the light on their skin flinches toward the violet spectrum, they're afraid. You are a sensor, Isora. Use every bit of data the universe gives you. She was a sponge. She absorbed the signs with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. By the end of the first day, she could sign basic tactical reports. By the second, she was asking me questions about Earth, about the wars we fought in the dark, and about the man I used to be. Why do they call you the ghost? She signed as the second sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of neon pink. I paused, my hands resting on the stone railing. Because I was good at disappearing, because I could hear things that weren't being said, but mostly because when things went wrong, I was the one they decided didn't exist. She watched me, her head tilted. The 1200. You think about them? Every hour I signed, every minute. She stepped closer, her silver eyes searching mine. They are not gone. They are in your dissonance, like my voice is in mine. That was when I decided to test my theory. I had spent the previous night hacking into the tower's antiquated medical scanners, recalibrating them to focus on Isora's neural activity during our sessions. Isora, I signed. I need to see something. I need to look at your light receptors. Not with my eyes, but with a machine. She looked wary. The ethel were protective of their physiology. To them, the light receptors were sacred, the seat of the soul. My mother says they are broken, like a burnt-out star. Maybe, I signed, but even a burnt-out star leaves a signature. I think yours is still burning. It's just being muffled. She hesitated, then nodded. We moved into the inner chamber, where I had set up a makeshift diagnostic station using a modified environmental sensor. I had spent 6 hours rewiring the damn thing, bypassing the safety protocols that would have sent a red alert to Varick's office. Sit, I said. She sat on the diagnostic bed, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. I activated the sensor. A holographic display bloomed in the center of the room, a complex web of silver and blue lines representing her neural pathways. It was beautiful. It was a map of a mind that was constantly seeking connection, a network of firing neurons that looked like a galaxy in motion. But as I zoomed in on the temporal lobes, the area responsible for frequency processing, I saw it. A jagged, charcoal-colored smudge on the hologram. It looked like a scar, but as I adjusted the filters, I realized it wasn't a wound. It was a foreign signal, an active, high-frequency jammer embedded at the base of her brainstem. My breath caught. It was Terrasol technology, a Mark IV neural dampener, specifically designed for deep-cover operatives who needed to be immune to telepathic or frequency-based interrogation. Isora saw my expression. What is it? She signed, her fingers trembling. I felt a cold, sharp rage settle in my gut. This wasn't a birth defect. It wasn't a tragedy of nature. It was an act of war. It's not broken, Isora, I signed, my hands moving with a savage precision. You're being jammed. There is a device inside you, a piece of human technology. It's been there for a long time. It's designed to drown out your people's light speech before your brain can even process it. She stared at the hologram, her face turning a deathly shade of white. Human? My mother? She knew? I don't know what she knew, I signed, but someone from my world put that there. Someone who wanted to make sure you never spoke. Someone who wanted the heir to the throne to be silent. The implications were a clusterfuck of epic proportions. If Isora was being jammed by Terrasol Tech, it meant the conspiracy that destroyed me at K9 went all the way to the heart of Ethelgard. It meant the disgraced cryptographer hadn't been sent here by accident. I had been sent here because I was the only person with a specific set of skills to recognize that particular brand of treason. Isora stood up, her starlight silks rustling. She walked to the holographic display and reached through it, her hand passing through the charcoal smudge on her brain. Take it out, she signed. I shook my head. Hey, I'm a codebreaker, Isora, not a surgeon. If I try to remove that without the proper equipment, it'll scramble your brain like a plate of eggs. We need a med bay, a real one, and we need someone we can trust. Silas, she signed immediately. The agent. He is different. He looks at my mother with eyes that do not shine. He looks at me with eyes that are sad. I remembered the Ethel agent from the throne room. He had been quiet, observing from the shadows. He had a military gait, the walk of a man who had seen the ugly side of the galaxy. We need to be careful, I signed. If Varric knows I found this, we're toast. He'll have us zeroed out before we can even blink. We need to bug out of here, but we can't do it until we have a plan. Suddenly, the door to the chamber hissed open. I instinctively stepped in front of the hologram, my hand going to the concealed knife I'd made out of a piece of reinforced quartz. But it wasn't Varric or a guard. It was Empress Xylia. She stood in the doorway, her skin glowing with a frantic, pulsating violet. She wasn't wearing her ceremonial robes. She was draped in a simple, dark cloak that seemed to absorb the light of the room. Behind her, Silas stood like a shadow, his hand resting on the hilt of a pulse pistol. "Turn off the sensor," the Empress signaled, her light flickering with an intensity I hadn't seen before. "Now." I didn't move. I kept my hand on the quartz knife. "Your radiance," I said, my voice cold. "I think we need to talk about your daughter's health." The Empress stepped into the room, the door closing behind her with a definitive thud. She looked at the hologram, her silver patterns flaring with a deep, agonizing shame. "I know what is there," she signaled. Her light was a muddy, broken gray, the color of old ash. Isra stepped around me, her hands moving with a speed that was almost violent. "You knew. You let them do this to me. For 20 years? The Empress reached out, her fingers trembling, but Isra recoiled as if she'd been burned. "I did it to save your life," the Empress signaled. Her light speech was fragmented, the grammar breaking down under the weight of her emotion. "The harmony consensus, the arch-consuls. They were afraid of your frequency. When you were born, your light was too strong. It was a resonance that would have shattered the prism. They wanted to prune you, to ensure the succession went to someone they could control." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, regal terror. "Varric brought the human. Admiral Harrison. He said the device would only dim your light. He said it would keep you safe until the political tides turned. I was weak. I was a mother before I was an empress, and I chose your silence over your death." I felt a jolt of electricity go through me. Admiral Harrison, the man who had presided over my court-martial. The man who had signed the orders for the K9 mission. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they were forming was a nightmare. Harrison wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was an architect of galactic instability. He was using Ethelgard as a laboratory for his neural dampeners, and he had the arch-consul in his pocket. "Admiral Harrison is the reason I'm here, Your Radiance," I said, my voice echoing in the cold chamber. "He's the one who framed me. And if he's working with Varric, then this isn't just about a trade agreement. They're building something. A way to control frequencies on a global scale." The Empress nodded slowly. "The Harmony Festival. 3 days from now, they are going to activate a void dampener. It will sync with the device in Isora's brain. She will become a transmitter. She will drown out the light song of every Ethel in the city, leaving them helpless while Harrison's fleet enters the system." Isora stood perfectly still. She looked at the hologram of her own brain, at the charcoal smudge that was both her cage and her mother's sin. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She slowly raised her hands and looked at her mother. "You let him turn me into a weapon," she signed. The simplicity of the sign was more devastating than any light speech could ever be. "I am trying to stop him," the Empress signaled, her skin now a deep, bruised indigo. "But I am watched. Varric has control of the palace guard. Silas is the only one I can trust, and even he is limited. That is why I brought you here, Calum Vance. I knew you were the ghost. I knew you were the only one who could see the device without triggering the alarms." "You used me," I said, a bitter taste filling my mouth. "You used me just like Harrison did." "Yes," she signaled, "but unlike Harrison, I am offering you a chance to save more than just 1,200 lives. I am offering you the chance to save an entire world. And to give my daughter the voice I stole from her." I looked at Isora. She was looking at me, waiting. She had been betrayed by her mother, her culture, and my people. She was standing in the center of a galactic firestorm, and she had no one but a disgraced soldier with a quartz knife. "What do we do?" She signed to me. I took a deep breath. I looked at the Empress, then at Silas, then back at the girl who had become the only thing that mattered in this godforsaken galaxy. We go to work, I signed. We have 3 days to hack a planetary defense system, neutralize an admiral, and get that piece of trash out of your head. It's going to be a total foobar situation, but we've got one advantage they don't. What? Isora signed. I smiled, a sharp, dangerous thing. They think you're silent. They think you're a hollow. They're expecting a princess, but we're going to give them an operative. Silas stepped forward, his light pattern a steady, determined green. We need to move, he signaled. Varric's patrols are increasing. If we're going to do this, we need to get to the old archives. There's a prototype medical unit there that can handle the extraction. I nodded. Let's bug out, I signed to Isora. She grabbed her cloak and followed us into the shadows of the tower. As the door hissed shut behind us, I realized that the silence was finally over. The war had changed shape, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for a government or a commission. I was fighting for the girl in the starlight silks. The second moon was high in the sky now, its pale light reflecting off the obsidian walls like a ghost. We were moving through the service ducts, a cramped, dusty maze of cables and conduits that even the ethel light speech couldn't penetrate. I stayed in the lead, my hands hovering near the walls, feeling for vibrations. Behind me, Isora moved with a quiet intensity, her silver eyes scanning the darkness. We were no longer furniture. We were no longer shadows. We were the dissonance, and we were about to break the harmony of Ethelgard. The path ahead was dangerous. The Empress's secret medbay was 3 kilometers away, through a gauntlet of Varric's loyalists and Harrison's automated surveillance. But as I looked back at Isora, she raised her hand and signed a single word. Hope. I didn't have the heart to tell her that hope was the most dangerous weapon of all. I just nodded and kept moving, deeper into the dark, toward the only voice that mattered. The sublumina was a graveyard of abandoned dreams. Located 3 kilometers beneath the radiant spires of Orizon, these tunnels were the original roots of the city, grown from a darker, more primitive strain of crystal that didn't know how to sing. Here the air was thick with the scent of wet stone and ancient decaying circuits. There were no auroras here, only the dim flickering amber of emergency biolume strips that looked like dying embers in a cold hearth. Move it, Vance! We're burning daylight, and Varric's hounds are already sniffing the ducks, Silas signaled, his light a sharp, urgent yellow that cut through the gloom. He moved with a predator's grace, his hand never straying far from the pulse pistol at his hip. I adjusted the heavy medical pack on my shoulder, the straps digging into my collarbone. Don't get your panties in a wad, Sparky, I grunted, my voice raspy in the damp air. I'm moving as fast as a meat sack can in this gravity. If you want more speed, find me a grav sled. Otherwise, watch our 6 and keep your glow stick on a low setting. Silas's skin flared a brief, annoyed orange. You have a peculiar way of speaking, human. Panties? Sparky? Is this how your military prepares for a covert extraction? It's called color, I said, shifting the weight of the pack. Something you light talkers could use a bit more of. Now where's this miracle med bay? We reached a heavy bulkhead made of reinforced lead glass. Silas placed his palm against a concealed sensor, and the door hissed open with a groan that sounded like a tectonic plate shifting. Inside was a time capsule from the first era of contact. The equipment was a hodgepodge of ethel crystal tech and bulky utilitarian human hardware from 25 years ago. It was exactly the kind of place Admiral Harrison would have loved, hidden, untraceable, and built on the bones of a secret alliance. In the center of the room sat a Mark VII surgical pod, its sleek white surface stained with decades of dust. I recognized the model immediately. It was a high-risk unit designed for battlefield neurology, the kind of gear used when you needed to pull shrapnel out of a pilot's brain while the hull was melting around you. Isora walked toward the pod, her eyes wide as she traced the human letters etched into the side. Terrasol Medical Systems. She looked at me, her hands trembling as she signed. This is where I become whole. I walked over to her, taking her hands in mine. Her fingers were ice cold. This is where we take the wall down, Isora, but it's going to be a rough ride. That jammer is a real piece of work. It's tied into your optic nerves and your auditory cortex. When I flip the switch, your brain is going to get hit with 20 years of data all at once. She didn't look away. I have lived in the dark for 7,000 days, teacher. I am not afraid of the light. I am afraid of staying like this. I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat that had nothing to do with the dusty air. She was braver than any soldier I'd served with at K9. They had been fighting for credits and commissions. She was fighting for the right to exist in her own skin. Silas, I need you on the environmental controls, I said, switching to my commander's tone. Keep the oxygen at 24% and drop the room temperature to 10 degrees Celsius. I need her metabolic rate as low as possible without inducing a coma. The ethyl agent nodded, his light turning a focused, professional blue. Understood. What about the power draw? This unit will spike the palace grid. I pulled a small black box from my pack, a portable fusion cell I'd liberated from the embassy's backup stores. Not if we jumpstart it with this. It's a dirty little gearhead trick, but it'll keep us off the radar for at least 40 minutes. After that, we're Oscar Mike or we're toast. I assisted Isora into the pod. As the glass canopy slid shut, she looked at me one last time, her silver eyes reflecting the flickering amber lights of the room. I felt the weight of my prejudice, the way I'd initially seen her as just a mission, a way to clear my name. But looking at her now, I realized she wasn't a mission. She was the only truth I had left. All right, kid, I whispered, even though she couldn't hear me. Let's see what you're made of. The procedure was a nightmare. The Mark IV neural dampener wasn't just sitting on her brainstem. It had grown tendrils, weaving itself into her very identity. Every time I tried to isolate a connection, the device would pulse, sending a feedback loop that made Isora's body jerk against the restraints. Her skin flared a frantic, pained violet, then faded to a terrifying, translucent white. Vance, her vitals are redlining, Silas signaled, his light strobing like a distress beacon. You're killing her. Shut up and watch the pressure, I snapped, my fingers flying across the holographic interface. This isn't a surgical op anymore. It's a mind clearance mission. If I pull back now, the dampener will go into fail-safe mode and liquefy her frontal lobe. I have to ghost the signal. I closed my eyes for a second, falling back into the headspace I'd occupied at K9. I didn't see the brain as meat. I saw it as a sequence of frequencies. The jammer was a high-frequency wall. I didn't need to break it. I needed to phase shift it. I began to input a series of counter codes, the same ones I'd used to crack the hegemony's black box transmissions. Slowly, the charcoal smudge on the display began to throb. It was fighting back, a predatory piece of software designed by a man who saw children as collateral damage. I've got you, you bastard, I muttered. With a final decisive keystroke, I initiated the bypass. The room was suddenly filled with a sound I can only describe as a crystal breaking in slow motion. It was a high-pitched, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in my very marrow. Isora's eyes snapped open. Her skin didn't just glow. It erupted in a blinding, kaleidoscopic brilliance that illuminated every corner of the dark medbay. She arched her back, a scream tearing from her throat, a sound so raw and powerful it shattered the glass monitors nearby. I dove for the manual override, killing the power. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a vacuum after an explosion. Isora lay still in the pod, her skin a faint, shimmering silver. For a moment, my heart stopped. I thought I'd zeroed her out. I thought I'd failed again. Then her hand moved. She didn't sign. She reached up and touched the glass of the canopy, her fingers trembling. Her eyes found mine, and for the first time there was no barrier, no lag, no dissonance. I opened the canopy. Isora sat up slowly, her movements shaky. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from the glowing strips on the walls to the humming fusion cell. Every small sound, the drip of water from a pipe, the hum of the ventilation, made her flinch. Everything. It speaks, she signed, but her movements were different. They were fluid, rhythmic, almost like a dance. The air is full of patterns. I can hear the stone. I can hear the dark. I helped her out of the pod, my hand steadying her. That's the world, Isora. It's been waiting for you. She looked at Silas. The agent was standing still, his skin a soft emerald green, a sign of deep respect. Isora reached out and touched his arm, then looked at me. His light, she signed. It's not just a color, it's a feeling. He is proud, and he is sad. Why is he sad? Silas looked at me, then back at the princess. He didn't signal. He simply bowed, a deep, reverent inclination of his head that spoke louder than any frequency. We don't have time for a victory lap, I said, checking my slate. The power spike was contained, but Varric isn't an idiot. He'll send a sweep team to investigate the sublumina within the hour. We need to reach the archives. Isora stood on her own, her posture straighter than I'd ever seen it. She didn't look like a girl anymore. She looked like a queen who had just reclaimed her kingdom. Lead the way, teacher, she signed. I want to see what else they've been hiding in the dark. As we moved back into the tunnels, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the surgery. It was going to be the truth. Because now that Isora could hear, she was going to hear the screams of a past that had been buried in the name of harmony. And I was the only one who could help her decode the cost of that silence. The old archives were not a library of books, but a forest of memory crystals. Thousands of translucent shards were suspended in a lattice of magnetic fields, each one containing the sensory data of 5 centuries of ethel history. The air here was colder than the tunnels, chilled to absolute zero to prevent data decay. Isora walked through the forest, her hand grazing the crystalline structures. Now that the jammer was gone, she was experiencing the room as a physical weight. Every crystal emitted a faint, unique resonance, a ghost of a conversation, a fragment of a decree, a sob from 1,000 years ago. It's too much, she signed, her eyes squeezed shut. Every stone is screaming. Focus, Isora, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Narrow your spectrum. Don't try to hear everything. Find the frequency that matches the jammer. Look for the charcoal signal. I sat at a central terminal, my fingers dancing across an interface that felt like it was made of frozen light. Silas stood by the entrance, his pulse pistol drawn. He was our eyes. I was the brain. Isora was the heart. It was a classic 3-man cell, the kind of unit that could topple a government if given enough time. I found the sector for the era of the Harmony Accord. This was the period 20 years ago when the war with the hegemony had supposedly been won through a combined effort of Terrasol intelligence and ethel technology. I began to dig. I bypassed the public records, the fluff about unity and shared sacrifice, and went straight for the encrypted military logs. I used the same decryption algorithms that had cost me my career. If Harrison was behind this, his signature would be here. He was an arrogant prick. He always left a thumbprint on his work. There, I muttered. A file appeared, protected by a triple-layer quantum lock. Its ID was Project Silent Harvest. Silas moved closer, his skin turning an alarmed violet. I've heard rumors of that name. My mentors spoke of it in whispers. They said it was a plan to stabilize the outer rim. It wasn't a stabilization plan, I said, my eyes scanning the data as it began to decrypt. It was a harvest. I opened the first log. It was a video transmission, dated 3 days before the K9 massacre. Admiral Harrison's face filled the screen. He looked younger, his uniform crisp, his eyes filled with that same cold, calculated ambition I remembered from my trial. Consul Varric, Harrison's voice was smooth like oil on water. The prototype is ready. The K9 station will serve as the perfect testing ground. It's isolated, the population is expendable, and the mineral composition of the asteroid will amplify the void dampener's range. Varric's voice replied, though he wasn't on screen. And the blame? We cannot have this traced back to our alliance. We have a scapegoat, Harrison said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. A young cryptographer named Vance. He's brilliant, he's dedicated, and he's a bit of a loner. We've already planted the evidence of his communication with the hegemony. When K9 goes dark, the galaxy will scream for his head, and we'll be there to offer them security in exchange for their freedom. I felt the air leave my lungs. I had known I was framed, but hearing it, seeing the casual way they had discussed the deaths of 1,200 people just to test a weapon, it was like taking a physical blow to the stomach. Isora reached out and touched the holographic display. Her skin was a deep, mournful indigo. She signed, her movements heavy with a sudden, terrible weight. They didn't just hurt me. They killed your people to test the machine that silenced me. It's worse than that, I signed, my hands shaking. I scrolled further into the file. There were diagrams, blueprints for a planetary-scale version of the K9 device. But this one didn't use minerals to amplify the signal. It used a biological relay. The dissonance, Harrison's voice continued in a later log. Their brains are essentially empty frequencies. By embedding a dampener in the royal air, we create a living antenna. During the Harmony Festival, when the Empress initiates the planetary light song, we flip the switch. The air will absorb the collective energy of the population and rebroadcast it as a void frequency. It will shut down every neural pathway on the planet simultaneously. Silas let out a low, guttural growl. They aren't just trying to conquer us. They're trying to lobotomize us. And who's powering the weapon right now, I asked, pointing to a subroutine in the code. Look at the energy siphon. It's been active for 10 years. I cross-referenced the coordinates of the siphon with the palace maps. The energy wasn't coming from a reactor. It was coming from the Asylum of the Echoless, a facility on the moon of Ethelgard where all the dissonants were sent when they reached adulthood. They're draining their own people, I said, my voice thick with disgust. Every person born with a frequency defect is being turned into a battery for this weapon. The harmony your people celebrate is literally built on the stolen life force of the people you've spent centuries ignoring. Isora stood back, her eyes fixed on the forest of crystals. She looked like she was about to shatter. The world she had lived in, the world she had fought so hard to join, was a lie. The people who were supposed to be her family had used her as a component in a machine of mass murder. I am a battery, she signed, a single tear of silver light tracking down her cheek. I am not a princess. I am a part of the engine. I stood up and walked to her. I didn't care about military protocol. I didn't care about being a shadow. I grabbed her shoulders and forced her to look at me. Listen to me, Isora. They saw a tool. They saw a defect. They saw something they could use and throw away because they refused to actually see you. They thought your silence made you empty. But they were wrong. Your silence was where you built your strength. You heard the truth because you didn't have the distraction of the lie. I pointed to the archives. We have the data. We have the voice. And in 2 days, at that festival, we're going to show them exactly what happens when the battery decides to start an electrical fire. Isora looked at me, her silver eyes clearing. The sadness was still there, but beneath it was a cold, hard diamond of resolve. She reached up and wiped the silver tear from her face. What is the next move, teacher? She signed. We need to get this data to the Empress, I said. If she knows Harrison and Varric are planning to lobotomize her entire race, she'll have to act. Silas shook his head, his light a grim, charcoal gray. The Empress is already being monitored. If we try to approach her, Varric will know. We need a way to broadcast this to the entire city. We need to break the harmony before it breaks us. Then we go to the North Spires, I said, the main broadcast hub. If we can hijack the frequency during the opening ceremony, we can show the whole planet what's in these files. Vance, that's a suicide mission, Silas signaled. That hub is guarded by a battalion of Varric's elite. We'll be dead before we reach the first relay. Then we'll just have to be ghosts, won't we? I said, checking the charge on my slate. I've spent my whole life being invisible. It's time to see what happens when the invisible man decides to make some noise. Suddenly, a red light began to pulse throughout the archives. A high-pitched, warbling siren echoed through the crystalline forest. The sweep teams, Silas signaled, his skin flaring a violent, combat-ready crimson. They've found the power spike from the med bay. They're locking down the sector. I grabbed Isora's hand. Time to bug out, kids. Silas, you take point. Isora, stay on my 6. We're heading for the service shafts. As we ran through the forest of memories, the crystals around us began to hum in unison, a discordant, terrifying sound. The harmony was hunting us. I looked at Isora as we reached the shaft. She was no longer flinching at the noise. She was running with her head up, her eyes focused on the dark ahead. She had lost her world, her mother's trust, and her identity in the space of an hour. But in the ruins of those lies, she had found something more dangerous to the Arch-Consul than any pulse pistol. She had found her own truth, and as we descended into the dark, I knew that Harrison had made the same mistake twice. He had underestimated the man who knew too much, and he had completely ignored the girl who heard everything. The cost of their prejudice was about to become very, very high. The morning of the Harmony Festival arrived not with a sunrise, but with a tidal wave of choreographed radiance. From the Tower of Echoes, the city of Orizon looked like a living jewel, every crystalline facet pulsing in a synchronized rhythmic gold. It was beautiful, but to me, knowing what lay beneath the soil, it felt like looking at the painted face of a corpse. We stood in the maintenance crawl space of the North Spires, 40 levels above the festive crowds. The air was thin and vibrated with the hum of the planetary broadcast relays. Silas was checking the charge on his pulse rifle, his skin a grim, tactical charcoal. Isora stood by the vent, her silver eyes fixed on the central plaza below. She was wearing a stolen technician's jumpsuit, her starlight silks replaced by rugged, oil-stained synth fiber. "Sit, Rep," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the drone of the cooling fans. Silas signaled with a sharp, efficient flicker of emerald. "The main platform is live. Empress Zilia is in position. Varric's elite are thick as thieves around the perimeter. We have approximately 30 minutes before the high song begins." I looked at Isora. She wasn't flinching at the noise anymore. She was absorbing it, her brow furrowed in concentration as she filtered the massive influx of data. Since the surgery, she had become a human-ethel hybrid sensor, capable of seeing the dissonance in the supposedly perfect harmony. "The guards, they aren't just standing," she signed, her hands moving with a rhythmic, sharp precision. "Their light patterns are looped. It's a ghost signal. They're using holographic overlays to hide their real numbers." "Smart," I muttered. "Harrison's playbook. Use the parade to mask the troop movements. He's got at least 3 companies of mercenaries tucked away in the shadows, waiting for the signal to bag and tag the entire court." I pulled out my slate, the screen flickering with the decrypted files from the archives. The plan was simple, which meant it had 1,000 ways to go sideways. We needed to reach the master relay, the heart of the North Spires. If I could patch Isora into the broadcast, she could use her unique neural frequency to override the harmony and project the truth. We weren't just going to tell them, we were going to make them feel the cost of their perfection. "Teacher," Isora signed, grabbing my sleeve. "The energy siphon. It's spiking. I can feel the echoless on the moon. They are screaming through the grid." I felt a cold shiver. The batteries, the thousands of dissonants being drained of their life force to power the void dampener, were reaching a critical state. Harrison wasn't just using them, he was burning them out. If we didn't stop this today, there wouldn't be any dissonance left to save. "Let's get this show on the road," I said, checking the quartz knife tucked into my boot. "Silas, you take the high ground. Cover our 6. Isora, stay tight. We're going to have to ghost through the next 10 levels." Silas nodded, his light turning a steady, determined green. "Do not fail, human. If the high song starts before we reach the relay, the entire planet becomes a graveyard." "No pressure, then?" I grunted. "Move your ass, Sparky." We slipped into the ventilation shaft, crawling through a maze of glowing conduits and humming data pipes. The North Spires were the brain of Ethelgard, and we were the virus. Every few meters, a security sweep would pulse through the walls, a wave of brilliant white light that searched for biological signatures. "Freeze," Isora signed. We pressed our bodies against the cold crystal as a sweep passed just millimeters from my boots. My heart was thumping like a drum, a primitive human sound in a world of high-frequency precision. Isora reached out and touched the wall, her skin shimmering in a way that mimicked the surrounding crystal, a natural camouflage I hadn't known she possessed. "They are looking for the light," she signed. "They don't know how to see the shadow." "That's their mistake," I whispered. "They think anything that doesn't shine is broken. They're so blinded by their own brilliance, they can't see the man standing right in front of them." We'd reached the level 30 maintenance hatch. Beyond it lay the relay chamber, a cathedral of spinning data shards and energy vortices. But the hatch was guarded by 2 of Varric's elite, their skin a shimmering, aggressive red that signaled their combat sync was active. "I'll draw them off," I said, reaching for a smoke canister. "No," Isora signed, her eyes glowing with a sudden, fierce intelligence. "I will. I am the princess. They will not fire on me immediately. You need the time to bypass the terminal. Isora, that's too risky. Those guys are on hair-trigger protocols. They see a dissonant out of place. They'll shoot first and ask questions never. They see a dissonant, she signed, her jaw set in a hard line. But I am no longer just that. I am the one who hears. Watch me, teacher. This is what you taught me. Before I could stop her, she kicked the hatch open and stepped onto the gantry. Halt! One of the guards signaled, his light turning a jagged, blinding white. Restricted sector. Identify. He stopped. Even through the red haze of his combat sync, he recognized her. The silent heir. The girl who was supposed to be locked away in the tower. Isora didn't move. She didn't sign. She simply stood there, her silver eyes fixed on the guard. She reached out with her mind, the new amplified perception we'd unlocked in the med bay, and tapped into the guard's frequency. Suddenly, the guard's light pattern began to fluctuate. He stumbled, his skin flickering between red and a confused, muddy brown. He dropped his rifle, his hands clawing at his head. What is this? He signaled, his light speech garbled and terrified. The noise! The screaming! He was hearing the echoless. Isora was acting as a bridge, channeling the agony of the drained dissonance directly into the guard's neural sync. It was a weapon they had no defense against because they had spent centuries pretending it didn't exist. The second guard raised his weapon, his skin flaring a murderous crimson. But I didn't give him the chance. I vaulted over the railing, my quartz knife catching the light as I drove it into the power cell of his armor. The suit short-circuited, the feedback knocking the guard unconscious. I grabbed Isora just as she was about to collapse. Her skin was a terrifying, translucent gray, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Isora, snap out of it! I shook her, my heart racing. She opened her eyes, the silver molten with tears. So many. Teacher. So many of them are dying. I know, I said, pulling her toward the master relay. That's why we're here. We're going to give them their voices back. But I need you to focus. I can't hack this thing alone. We reached the central console, a pillar of pure, pulsating diamond that stood in the center of a swirling vortex of light. This was it, the heart of the machine. All right, I said, my fingers hovering over the interface. Time to pull the pin and see what happens. I patched my slate into the pillar. The security firewalls were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Quantum encryption based on harmonic resonance. It wasn't just a code, it was a song. If I hit the wrong note, the whole system would lock down and incinerate us. Isora, I need you to listen to the firewall, I whispered. Tell me where the silence is. The holes in the music. That's where the back doors are. She closed her eyes and pressed her hands against the diamond pillar. Her skin began to pulse in sync with the machine, a soft, shimmering silver that stood out against the golden brilliance of the relay. There, she signed, pointing to a subroutine that was vibrating at a lower frequency, the Harrison frequency. It doesn't belong here. It's cold, like a dead moon. Got it, I said, my fingers flying. That's the override. If I can piggyback on that signal, we can hijack the entire planetary broadcast. The display on my slate turned green. We were in. Silas, we're at the relay, I spoke into my comms. How's the plaza looking? Silas's voice came back, strained and punctuated by the sound of distant explosions. The high song has begun. The Empress is initiating the link. Varric's men are moving into position to seal the plaza. You need to act now, Vance. I looked at the upload button. This was the moment, the point of no return. Once I hit this, the truth about Project Silent Harvest would be broadcast to every soul on Athelgard. The harmony would be broken. But as my finger hovered over the screen, the room was suddenly flooded with a blinding, jagged yellow light. I'm afraid I can't let you do that, Commander Vance, a voice boomed, not through a drone, but through the room's internal speakers. I turned. Standing on the far gantry, surrounded by a dozen elite guards, was Arch-Consul Varric, but he wasn't alone. Floating beside him was a holographic projection, the face of a man I'd hoped never to see again. Admiral Harrison. Well, Harrison said, his voice dripping with that same paternal condescension that had haunted my nightmares. The ghost returns. I must say, Vance, I'm impressed. You were always a stubborn little cockroach. I thought the K9 fallout would have crushed you, but here you are, still meddling in things you don't understand. I understand enough, Admiral, I spat, my hand moving toward the upload button. I understand that you're a mass murderer who's about to lose his biggest paycheck. Harrison laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Mass murderer? Don't be so dramatic. This is evolution. The Ethel are a resource, nothing more. Their harmony is a biological curiosity that we've merely refined into a tool for order. And as for losing my paycheck, look at your slate, Vance. I looked. The upload was frozen at 99%. A new command prompt had appeared, one that I didn't recognize. You see, Harrison continued, I knew you'd find the back door. I left it there for you. It's a failsafe. If you press that button, you will indeed broadcast the files. But you will also trigger the immediate total purge of the asylum of the Echoless. Every dissonant on that moon, 5,000 lives, will be liquidated instantly. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands shook as it hovered over the button. So here is your choice, Ghost, Harrison said, his eyes narrowing. Save your truth and kill 5,000 of the princess's kind. Or walk away, let the high song proceed, and I might, just might, let the girl live as my personal research subject. I looked at Isora. She had seen the signs. She understood the choice. The thematic core of my life, the idea that some people were expendable for the greater good, was being thrown in my face by the man who had perfected that lie. Harrison was betting that I was just like him, that I would sacrifice the broken to save the perfect plan. Teacher, Isora signed, her voice clear and strong. Don't look at the numbers. Look at me. I looked at her, and in that moment I realized that Harrison had already lost. Because he couldn't see Isora, he only saw a component. He didn't see the woman who had fought for her own voice. He didn't see the person who was willing to be more than a battery. And I realized what I had to do. The lesson wasn't about saving everyone. It was about truly seeing the value of the one right in front of you. You're a real piece of work, Harrison, I said, my voice as hard as the obsidian walls. But you forgot one thing about cryptographers. We don't just find back doors. We rewrite the damn code. I didn't press the upload button. I pressed a different one, the one that activated the manual override for the energy siphon. What are you doing? Varric signaled, his light turning a panicked orange. I'm changing the frequency, I said, looking at Isora. Ready? She nodded, a fierce silver light erupting from her skin. She reached out and grabbed the relay pillar, her eyes rolling back in her head. Isora, no! Varric signaled, moving toward us, but it was too late. She wasn't broadcasting the data. She was broadcasting herself. The master relay chamber didn't just vibrate. It groaned under the weight of an impossible resonance. Isora wasn't just a bridge. She was a supernova of raw, unfiltered dissonance. By tapping into the energy siphon, she wasn't draining the Echoless. She was drawing them into her. She was taking their silence, their pain, their stolen voices, and amplifying them through the planetary broadcast system. Vance, stop her! You're going to blow the whole grid! Harrison's hologram screamed, the image flickering as the interference hit his transmission. That's the point, Admiral, I yelled over the roar of the vortex. The harmony is built on a lie. Let's see how it handles the truth. Varric's guards opened fire. Bolts of jagged yellow energy tore through the air, but they were deflected by a shimmering silver barrier. It wasn't a technological shield. It was the sheer pressure of the frequency Isora was projecting. I dove behind the central console, my boots skidding on the crystal floor. I pulled my slate out and began to work the secondary override. If Isora was the transmitter, I had to be the filter. I had to ensure her signal didn't just burn out the brains of everyone on the planet, but instead delivered the message. Silas, I need cover! I shouted into the comms. A burst of green energy from the upper gantries took out two of Varric's guards. Silas dropped down, his light a blazing, combat-hardened emerald. I've got you, Vance, but this place is going to cave in 60 seconds. Just give me 45. I grunted, my fingers flying across the interface. The thematic conflict was no longer subtext. It was the literal battlefield. Harrison and Varric represented the harmony. a forced, sterile unity where the defective were harvested to maintain the facade. Isora and I were the dissonance, the messy, painful, honest reality of those who didn't fit into the box. I saw Varric moving toward the primary kill switch. He was glowing with a desperate, murderous white light. He knew that if Isora's signal reached the plaza, his reign was over. He was a man who had traded his conscience for a perfect frequency, and now the music was ending. You are destroying everything, Varric signaled, his light speech fractured and shrill. 500 years of order, gone. For what? A girl who cannot even sing? I stood up, stepping out from behind the console. I looked him dead in the eye. The arch-consul of Ethelgard, the man who thought he was a god. She's not singing your song, Varric, I said, my voice carrying over the roar of the machine. She's singing her own, and it's a lot louder than yours. I lunged at him. We collided on the narrow gantry, a blur of human muscle and ethel light. Varric was stronger than he looked, his skin pulsing with a kinetic energy that burned my arms like acid. He slammed me against the railing, his hand closing around my throat. You are nothing, he signaled, his face inches from mine. A shadow, a traitor, a meat sack in a world of light. I gasped for air, my vision beginning to blur. I reached for my boot, but he kicked my hand away. Die in the dark, ghost, he signaled. But then, the world stopped. The roar of the vortex vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Isora had finished the connection. I looked over Varric's shoulder. Isora was standing in the center of the vortex, her skin no longer silver, but a blinding, pure white, the color of a sun being born. She wasn't just projecting, she was seeing. Through the planetary broadcast, every Ethel in Orizon, every soldier in the plaza, even the Empress herself, suddenly experienced a collective vision. They saw the asylum. They saw the dissonance being drained. They saw the faces of the 1,200 who died at K9. And they saw Varric and Harrison, shaking hands over the blueprints of their lobotomized world. Varric froze. His light pattern began to flicker uncontrollably, turning a dull, terrified gray. He let go of my throat, his hands dropping to his sides. No, he signaled, his voice a pathetic, broken whimper. The harmony, it's gone. It was never there, Varric, I said, rubbing my throat as I stood up. It was just a mask, and the mask just fell off. I looked at the hologram of Harrison. The Admiral was no longer smiling. He was staring at the data stream with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. You've ruined it, Vance, Harrison whispered, his voice trembling with rage. You've destroyed the most perfect tool for order this galaxy has ever seen. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've unleashed chaos. You've given the broken a reason to fight. Good, I said, my hand hovering over the final command prompt. They've been quiet for too long. I hit the button. The master relay exploded in a shower of crystalline shards. The feedback loop traveled back through Harrison's transmission, overloading his remote systems. The hologram flickered, then vanished with a sharp, static pop. The room was suddenly dark, save for the faint, shimmering silver of Isora's skin. She collapsed into my arms, her body cold and limp. Isora, look at me. I cradled her head, my heart hammering against my ribs. She opened her eyes slowly. Her silver eyes were no longer molten. They were clear, calm, and filled with a peace I'd never seen before. I heard them, she signed, her movements shaky but deliberate. I heard all of them. They are free. We did it, kid, I whispered, a tear of relief escaping my eye. We really did it. Silas appeared beside us, his skin a soft, emerald green. The plaza, they're laying down their arms. The Empress is calling for a ceasefire. Varric's loyalists have no song to follow anymore. They're lost. Let them be lost, I said, helping Isora to her feet. It's about time they learned how to find their own way. But the victory felt hollow in my chest. I looked around the ruined chamber, at the shattered crystals and the cooling embers of the machine. We had broken the lie, but the cost had been staggering. 5 centuries of culture was in ruins. Thousands of lives were still in the balance on the moon. And Harrison was still out there, a wounded predator with an entire fleet at his command. The transformation was beginning, and it was painful. The Ethel weren't just losing their harmony, They were losing their identity, and I was the man who had pulled the trigger. As we walked out of the North Spires, the city of Orison was no longer pulsing in gold. It was a chaotic, flickering mess of colors, reds, blues, purples, and grays. It was messy. It was discordant. It was real. Izora stopped at the balcony, looking out over her kingdom. She reached out and touched the stone railing, her fingers tracing the cracks. "It's quiet now," she signed. "No, Izora," I said, looking at the thousands of individuals below, each one finding their own frequency for the first time in their lives. "It's finally loud enough to hear the truth." We had won the Battle of the Spires, but as I looked at the distant stars, I knew that the real war, the war for the soul of the galaxy, was just beginning. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for a flag or a rank. I was fighting for the people who had been told they were invisible. And as long as I had breath in my lungs and Isora had a voice in her hands, we would never stay quiet again. The thematic arc of my life had come full circle. I had been the man who saw the truth and was silenced. Now I was the man who had shattered the silence with the truth. And looking at the princess beside me, I realized that we were no longer ghosts. We were the symphony. The aftermath of the North Spires was not a victory march. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through a world that had forgotten how to function without a script. Outside the shattered windows of the relay chamber, Orison looked like a circuit board after a massive power surge. The golden rhythmic pulse was gone, replaced by a chaotic, flickering mess of colors that made my head ache. People were stumbling in the streets, their light speech fragmented into static. 5 centuries of the harmony had been ripped away in 10 seconds, and the Ethel were realizing for the first time that they were individuals. Cold, lonely, and terrified individuals. "Vance, get your head in the game. We've got a massive Charlie Foxtrot developing at the lunar docks." Silas's voice crackled through my comms. He was down in the plaza, trying to coordinate the evacuation of the wounded. "Harrison's fleet isn't bugging out. They've moved into high orbit, and they're charging their primary arrays. If we don't secure the Asylum Moon, they're going to glass the whole facility to hide the evidence of the harvest." I wiped a smear of crystalline dust and blood from my slate. "Tell me something I don't know, Sparky. How's the Empress?" "She's alive. She's currently in the command bunker, trying to keep the military from turning on each other. Half the admirals want to surrender to Harrison. The other half want to go out in a blaze of glory. It's a total mess." I looked at Isora. She was sitting on a pile of debris, her silver eyes fixed on her own hands. She looked small, but the silver light radiating from her skin was steady now. No longer the blinding supernova of the relay, but a quiet, enduring glow. She had heard the truth of her people, and it had changed her. She wasn't the silent princess anymore. She was the only person on this planet who knew how to live in the dissonance. "They are lost," she signed to me, her fingers moving with a heavy, deliberate grace. "They cannot hear the music anymore. They only hear the noise." "Then we'll have to teach them how to make their own music, kid," I said, offering her my hand. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my neural pathways were still screaming from the feedback loop, but we were out of time. "Harrison's coming for the moon. If he purges the asylum, the harvest continues under a new name. We have to bug out, now." Isora stood up, her jaw set. "The asylum is not a moon to me, teacher. It is a mass grave of my family. I am ready." We reached the hangar bay of the Spires, where a battered diplomatic shuttle sat among the ruins. It was an old Terrasol model, probably used by Harrison's goons for discreet transport. I spent 5 minutes hot-wiring the ignition while Isora stood guard with a pulse rifle she'd scavenged from a fallen loyalist. She held the weapon like a veteran. No hesitation, no fear. "Hold on to your teeth," I grunted as the engines roared to life. A rough mechanical sound that felt honest compared to the hum of the crystal tech. "It's going to be a bumpy ride through the debris field." As we broke the atmosphere, the scale of the disaster became clear. Orison was a mosaic of darkness and flickering light. But above us, the moon of Ethelgard, a jagged white crescent, loomed large. And surrounding it were the 12 warships of the Coalition's rogue fleet. Harrison's flagship, the Invictus, sat at the center like a predatory spider. "Vance to Silas, do you copy?" I barked into the long-range transmitter. "We're approaching the lunar facility. Any word from the Ethel defense grid?" Negative, Vance. The grid is offline. Varick's back doors were deeper than we thought. Harrison is jamming everything from Sector 1 to Sector 9. You're on your own. Godspeed, you magnificent bastard. The asylum was a fortress built into the side of a lunar crater. It was designed to keep people in, but today it was a slaughterhouse waiting to happen. I saw the Invictus begin to glow with a deep, ominous violet, the signature of a void dampener being primed for a planetary strike. He's not just glassing the facility, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical punch. He's going to use the energy from the dissonance one last time. He's going to overload the relay and burn out every brain on the surface of Ethelgard. He's liquidating the whole planet. Isora looked at the sensor slate, her silver eyes widening. He wants to finish the harmony. He wants the silence to be permanent. Not today, I said, pushing the shuttle's thrusters to the red line. Isora, get to the dorsal turret. I'm going to try and slip under their shield perimeter. If we can reach the main docking bay of the asylum, I can manually override the purge sequence. The next 10 minutes were a blur of screaming metal and exploding energy. Harrison's point defense cannons traced our path, filling the void with streaks of jagged yellow light. I threw the shuttle into a series of gut-wrenching rolls, my military training taking over. I wasn't the ghost anymore. I was a pilot with 1,200 ghosts at my back, and I wasn't going to let Harrison add 5,000 more to the tally. Check your six, kid, I yelled as a drone fighter locked onto our tail. Isora didn't answer with words. She answered with the dorsal turret. A stream of green plasma tore through the drone, detonating it in a cloud of debris. She was lead-footing the trigger, her movements perfectly synchronized with the vibrations of the ship. She wasn't hearing the battle. She was feeling it. We slammed into the asylum's docking bay at 200 kilometers per hour, the shuttle's landing gear shearing off as we skidded across the metal floor. I grabbed my pack and my quartz knife, hauling Isora out of the wreckage, just as the shuttle's fuel cells began to vent. The facility was a labyrinth of white, sterile hallways. It didn't smell like Ethelgard. It smelled like a hospital on Earth, bleach, ozone, and despair. Everywhere I looked, I saw the batteries. Thousands of Ethel, their skins pale and lightless, were strapped into glass pods. Tubes were fed into their light receptors, siphoning away their life force in a constant, agonizing drip. They are still alive, Isora signed, her hands shaking. I can hear their rhythm. It is so faint, like a heartbeat under deep water. We have to get to the core, I said, checking my slate. Harrison's countdown is at 4 minutes. If we don't break the siphon, the Invictus fires. We reached the central chamber, a massive circular room where the energy of 5,000 souls was being channeled into a single, pulsating crystal. Standing at the terminal was a man I recognized from the K9 security footage, a human technician, one of Harrison's inner circle. Vance, you're too late, the man screamed, reaching for a sidearm. The Admiral's orders are absolute. The harvest must be finalized. I didn't waste time with a witty comeback. I lunged across the floor, my military-grade boots providing the traction I needed. I tackled him before he could draw, my quartz knife finding the gap in his tactical vest. It was a dirty, gritty fight, the kind of struggle that had no place in the harmony. We rolled across the floor, punching and biting, until I managed to pin him down. Where's the kill switch? I growled, my hand around his throat. There is no switch, the man gasped, a bloody grin on his face. It's a one-way trip. I looked at the crystal. It was glowing with a blinding violet intensity. The air in the room was beginning to hum with the void frequency. 3 minutes. Isora walked toward the crystal. She didn't look at the technician. She didn't look at me. She looked at the 5,000 pods surrounding us. Teacher, she signed, her light speech soft and heartbreaking. The machine is built on the silence. To stop it, I must become the dissonance again. But I cannot do it from the outside. Isora, no, I said, my heart freezing. You told me the relay nearly killed you. This is 1,000 times stronger. If you step into that energy field, you'll be vaporized. I am not a battery, Calum, she signed, using my name for the first time. I am the voice, and the voice must speak for those who cannot. She stepped onto the platform. The violet light began to lash at her skin, tearing at her starlight silks. She didn't recoil. She reached out and placed her hands on the crystal. Suddenly, the room was filled with a sound that defied description. It was the collective scream of 5,000 souls, filtered through the heart of one brave girl. Isora's skin turned a pure, blinding white. She wasn't just absorbing the energy. She was reversing the polarity. She was pushing her own frequency, the frequency of the Reflex sign protocol, the frequency of connection, back into the grid. On the sensor slate, the Invictus's energy levels plummeted. The void dampener began to backfire, the violet light turning into a chaotic emerald green. "Isora, get out of there!" I yelled, shielding my eyes from the brilliance. But she didn't move. She stood there, a pillar of light in a room of shadows, her hands locked onto the crystal. The facility began to shake as the energy siphon collapsed. One by one, the glass pods began to hiss open. The dissonants were being released. Across the void, I saw the Invictus shudder. The feedback loop from the asylum had hit the flagship's primary array. A massive explosion blossomed at the heart of the warship, the secondary reactors failing. The Invictus didn't just drift, it broke apart. 1 billion credits of military hardware turned into stardust in the blink of an eye. Isora fell. I caught her before she hit the floor. Her skin was cold, her light almost entirely gone. She looked like a ghost. I pulled her to my chest, my own tears blurring my vision. "Don't you dare buy the farm, Isora. Not after all this. Check your six, kid. You're supposed to be a queen." She opened her eyes, the silver dull but present. She raised a shaking hand and touched my face. "I heard them," she signed, the movement so small I could barely see them. "They are not silent anymore." I looked around the room. The dissonants were stumbling out of their pods. They were pale, they were weak, and they were confused. But they were looking at each other. They were touching the walls. They were making sounds, raw, unpolished, beautiful sounds. The harvest was over. The silence was broken. But as I sat there on the floor of a lunar prison, holding the woman who had saved a world, I realized that the real work was just beginning. Harrison was gone, but the prejudice that had created him was still alive in every heart on Ethelgard. We had saved their lives, but now we had to save their souls. I looked at Isora, and for the first time in 34 years, I knew exactly who I was. I wasn't the ghost. I wasn't a traitor. I was the man who had seen the girl in the starlight silks and decided that her silence was the most important thing in the galaxy. "We're going home, Isora," I whispered, "and this time, we're going to make sure everyone is listening." 12 months had passed since the Invictus burned in the lunar sky. In the human calendar, that was a year. In the life of a civilization, it was the first breath of a new era. I stood on the balcony of the Tower of Echoes, though it was no longer called that. It was now the Center for Universal Sign, the primary hub of the Silent Voice Initiative. Below me, Orizon was a city transformed. The rigid golden harmony had been replaced by a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of light. People no longer walked in synchronized patterns. They moved with individual rhythms, their skin patterns a riot of personal expression. I checked my dress uniform, a new design that combined Terrasol military cuts with Ethel silk. I was no longer a shadow. I was the prince consort of Ethelgard, though most people still just called me Kylam, or the Ghost, though now the name was whispered with respect rather than fear. "Commander Vance, the delegation from Earth has arrived," Silas said, stepping onto the balcony. He was wearing the robes of the High Consul, his skin a steady, peaceful emerald. He had been the one to lead the purge of Varric's remnants, and he had done it with the cold efficiency of a man who knew the price of peace. "Ambassador Reeves is in the foyer. He looks like he swallowed a lemon." I smiled, a genuine expression that didn't feel like a mask anymore. "Reeves always looks like that. It's a job requirement for diplomats. Is the princess ready?" "She's been ready for 5 centuries, Calum. We were just the ones who were late to the party." We walked toward the grand arch of the prism. It had been rebuilt, but this time, the crystal wasn't translucent. It was etched with the history of the dissonants, their names carved into the very pillars that had once ignored them. Thousands of Ethel had gathered in the plaza, along with representatives from 40 different star systems. Isora stood at the apex of the dais. She looked magnificent. Her robes were no longer just starlight. They were woven with the charcoal and silver patterns of the RSP, the language that had saved her. As I took my place beside her, she reached out and caught my hand, her silver eyes shining with a brilliance that had nothing to do with frequency and everything to do with spirit. She stepped forward and began to speak. She didn't use a drone. She didn't use a translation slate. She used her hands and she used her voice, a voice that had grown strong and melodic through a year of practice. For 7,000 days, I lived in a world that saw me as a hollow. Isora signed and spoke simultaneously. Her voice projected through the new, non-invasive neural sync we had developed. I was told my silence was a defect. I was told that because I did not fit the harmony, I did not exist. But the man beside me, he didn't look for the light. He looked for the person. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, stopping on the thousands of formerly echoless who now stood in the front rows. "We are the dissonance," she continued, her hands moving with a power that felt like a symphony. "We are the jagged edges, the quiet shadows, and the unexpected notes. And it is our dissonance that makes the galaxy whole. Perfection is a prison. Harmony is a lie if it requires the harvest of those who are different. Today, we don't celebrate the light song. We celebrate the symphony of shadows." The crowd didn't applaud. They flared. 1,000,000 colors erupted across the plaza, a chaotic, beautiful explosion of individuality that made the old harmony look like a flickering candle. As the ceremony concluded and the diplomats began their inevitable squabbling over trade routes and treaties, I stepped back from the podium. I felt a strange sense of peace, a weightlessness I hadn't felt since before the K9 disaster. I had spent 15 years of my life breaking codes, but I had finally found the only one that mattered. I spent 34 years of my life believing that my value was measured by my utility. In the intelligence corps, I was a meat computer. At my court-martial, I was expendable furniture. I had been trained to see the world as a series of tactical problems to be solved, of frequencies to be neutralized, of people to be used as components in a larger machine. I thought that to be a hero, I had to be perfect, to be the one who never missed a signal. But standing on this alien soil, looking at a girl who was supposed to be a defect and seeing instead the strongest person I've ever known, I realized how wrong I was. The K9 massacre happened not because I failed a code, but because men like Harrison saw people as numbers on a spreadsheet. They saw 1,200 lives as a necessary cost for a weapon. I spent so long running from my own shadows, thinking they made me a monster. I thought my silence after the trial was my punishment, but Isora taught me that the silence isn't a void. It's a space where you can finally hear yourself. My flaws didn't make me broken. They made me real. They were the dissonance that allowed me to see the truth when everyone else was blinded by the light. I look at the insignia on my sleeve, the one they gave back to me after the trial, and I realize it's just a piece of metal. My real honor isn't in a rank or a commission. It's in the way Isora looks at me when no one else is watching. It's in the way 5,000 people on a lunar base got a second chance because a disgraced soldier decided that one girl's voice was worth more than his own life. We spend our lives trying to be somebody, trying to fit into the perfect frequencies of our societies, only to realize that the most important thing you can ever be is the person who sees the one everyone else is ignoring. Isora joined me at the edge of the dais. The triple sunset was beginning, the sky a bruised, beautiful purple. She looked at me and signed a question she'd been asking a lot lately. "What now, Caleb?" "Now," I said, looking at the city we had helped break in the world we were helping build. "We keep talking, we keep listening, and we make sure that no one ever has to stay quiet again." She smiled, and for a moment, the 3 sons of Ethelgard were the second brightest things on the planet. I turned to the people of the galaxy, to the grunts, the ghosts, and the people who have spent their lives being told they don't fit the song. I spent years carrying the shame of K9 like a shield, thinking my worth was gone because the world had decided I was a failure. I wonder, is there a part of yourself that you have been hiding because you were told it made you broken, or less? What if that very thing, that dissonance in your own song, is actually the only part of you that is truly, undeniably real? Isora raised her hand and made a final sign. It wasn't RSP. It wasn't Ethel. It was a new gesture we'd created together. It meant I see you. The first moon rose, a silver sliver in the darkening sky, And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt like the light. Isora leaned her head on my shoulder, and together, we watched the stars come out, each one a different frequency, each one a different story, all of them finally being heard.